We begin with President Obama taking his economic proposals to the conservative heartland a day after delivering a defiant State of the Union speech.
Will we accept an economy where only a few of us do spectacularly well? Or will we commit ourselves to an economy that generates rising incomes and chances for everyone who makes the effort?
But the president's trip to red states, Idaho and Kansas, only underscored the irony for a skeptical Republican-led Congress, which has repeatedly said tax increases on the wealthy are a non-starter.
But he owes it to the American people to find a serious way to work with the representatives that they elected. There's not a lot of serious lawmakers can do with talking points designed specifically not to pass.
There's no sign the endless squabbling will stop anytime soon. House Speaker John Boehner said Wednesday he invited Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel to speak before a joint session of Congress next month, blindsiding the White House, which called the move a departure from protocol. Speaker Boehner disagreed.
I did not consult with the White House. The Congress can make this decision on its own. I don't believe I'm poking anyone in the eye. There is a serious that exists in the world. And the president last night kind of papered over it.
As the speaker said, critics argued this president glossed over the rising threat of terrorism and presented in general an overly rosy picture of his domestic agenda.
This is good news, people.
For more, we're joined from Capitol Hill by Democratic Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, who represents Illinois' 9th District. She wrote an opinion piece for USA Today this week entitled "Millionaires' Tax Will Boost Economy." We're also joined by Democratic Congressman Luis Gutierrez, who represents Illinois' 4th District. He will be visiting at least a dozen cities in the coming weeks to educate immigrants and the broader community about the president's executive actions on immigration. It is very good to see you both, to have you both on the show. I want to start with the State of the Union. If you just arrived on Earth, you never would have known from the president's speech that there was a big win by Republicans in November. The president himself said after his own win in 2012 that elections have consequences. Congresswoman, is there a bit of denial there, seeing the laundry list of things that he's laid out that Republicans don't like?
You know, actually, one of the consequences is that the president is unleashed to offer the kinds of proposals that I think the middle class really wants to hear, to push back, to talk about building an economy from the middle out, and I think it's resonating with the American people. We saw some overnight polling and some focus groups. His numbers have gone up, and there's a lot of support for the kinds of things he was talking about yesterday to help the middle class survive and thrive.
Well, talking about unleashed. Well, I'll get to you right now, Congressman. You know, much has been made about the tone the president took. The LA Times described him as boastful, confident, even cocky. The Guardian remarked on his swagger. Discussed on this show how some of the GOP's first actions after taking control of both houses did not bode well for bipartisanship because they focused on passing things they know the president will veto. Wasn't the president the flip side of the coin last night, seemingly sabotaging bipartisanship?
Well, it seems to me that the Republicans are fighting the last war. They continue to fight on immigration when I think that battle is really over. Most Americans support that, and we should move forward. They continue to want to undo the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and they are continuing a war on women, even as we speak today. And so I think the Republicans are off base.
Congressman, I wanted to get your reaction to that question.
Yeah, I thought the president was confident, looking towards the future. I didn't see a president with recriminations. Actually, he went up to the woman and the family that was sitting next to the First Lady and said it was hardworking Americans like them, and used them as an example of kind of all of Americans picking themselves up by their bootstraps and saying that's the way we should do it. Here's what I heard, Antonio. I heard the president said, let's stop pointing fingers at each other and kind of saying no before we even finish the sentence. Why don't we listen to each other? So I kind of heard a president that was confident, but kind of turned the page, wasn't looking to the past, kind of setting the parameters.
But is that how was it received by your colleagues across the aisle?
Oh, really well. I got to tell you, I took out my calculator during the speech, and I took $174,000. That's what a member of Congress earns in a year, divided it by 12. And you know what I realized? The Congress of the United States will not raise the minimum wage, yet we earn in 1 month what we expect someone earning the minimum wage to live on in a whole year. I think that's shameful, and I think he brought that out in a very manner. And you know, every time they have a referendum in any state, any one of the states that had a referendum this last election where they put increasing the minimum wage on, it won resoundingly, even in Republican states like Arkansas.
All right, let's talk about the economic. Right, I want to talk about the. Go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say, it was like they were super glued, though, to their seats and that their hands were tied. You did not see the Republicans get up and clap or show any kind of approval, even when the president was talking about the good news of our economy. It was like they were not able to move.
Yeah, it just, again, worries a lot of people, I think, about the lack of compromise on a lot of issues. Let's talk about the economy. The president focused on taxing the rich. Congresswoman, you have made the point that we tax people who make $400,000 the same way we tax people who make $40 million. You just introduced the Fairness in Taxation Act. That would it is expected to raise $800 billion over the next decade by adding higher tax brackets for those biggest earners. But the Republicans rejected the president's proposed taxes. Do you hope to get support from across the aisle? And even if you do, would those $800 billion just be a drop in the bucket when it comes to the deficit and the national debt?
Well, first of all, $800 billion is a significant amount of money. I have support from many millionaires and multi-millionaires who think that they ought to pay their fair share. But, Antonio, up to $400,000, there are 7 tax brackets. Why should they stop there, especially since so much money has gone to the very, very wealthy in our country, the top 1% or the top 0.1%. And so the tax brackets that I have, starting at 45% at $1 million and going up to 49% at $1 billion, and people do earn $1 billion, there are some
there
in the
are some who
States,
do, yeah.
is still and that's still lower than the tax rate through most of the Reagan administration, the top tax rate. So I think that we ought to ask them we ought to update our tax code.
But what the other side would argue is that Treasury revenues are at record highs. So is the problem taxation or is it spending?
Well, let me just say this, Antonio, in terms of you signaled out that maybe it's a pessimistic note for the rest of the country. Well, you know, I've heard Paul Ryan, he's chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. He was pretty optimistic. He was optimistic last night. He's been optimistic in all the interviews he's given today. He looks forward to working with the president. I was excited. I voted against the North American Free Trade Agreement back in 1993, a Democratic proposal under Bill Clinton. I thought it was a bad proposal. But you know what? The president, I think, hit the right chord. He said, hey, if we're going to have trade agreements, they have to be fair trade agreements. I want to make sure American workers are protected. And you know, there was applause. And guess what? Paul Ryan was talking about, since he's going to be chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, all the trade agreements got to go to it. And secondly, just helping people raise their kids and giving them tax credits. I think there are going to be avenues in which we're going to be able to work together.
Some agreement.
Very popular. Yeah, I think we're going to be... Look, Antonio, I think many of the things the president spoke to are American values that the American people support. I mean, if everything we do is kind of say, well, what would the Republicans agree to, then let's not have a two-party system. I think this is about challenging one another, so let's challenge.
Well, let's talk about the issue that you are a big leader on, immigration. The president really didn't say much about that in the State of the Union. Republicans are continuing to threaten cutting funding on Homeland Security that would stop, to some extent, some of the president's executive action on immigration. There are reports, Congressman, that the Department of Homeland Security isn't ready to process the millions of additional immigrants that the action would allow to get work permits and deferred action because the system is just overburdened. Are you concerned?
Well, look, absolutely, we're always concerned about every application that is made before the federal government. But I have complete confidence in the Secretary of Homeland Security, in Mr. Johnson's ability to get this done. Let's remember, he was second in command just about, and did the whole don't ask, don't tell review and change and implementation over at the Department of Justice. So he knows what it is to make systemic changes. And he'll make that systemic change now over at Homeland Security. And let me just say this. You know what? I heard that, Antonio, from other people. The president didn't speak. But he spoke so loudly on November 20th that it's still being echoing throughout our community. We had a wonderful event, full house, Providence, Rhode Island. We had a full house in New Jersey on Friday. I'm going to Charlotte and I'm going to Charleston. And Jan and I are going to have an activity in this wonderful Catholic church out in her neck of the woods, in her congressional
on Valentine's Day.
And you can imagine.
You Illinois folks hanging together.
Saturday.
All right.
It's going to be Saturday. It's going to be Valentine's, and we're going to be sharing the love of this Congress and this president. So he doesn't really have to speak. We have to sign up 5 million people.
All right. I want to get a couple other questions in here. One is terrorism. That's something else that the president didn't really speak much about. Dana Milbank in the Washington Post contrasted the way the president spoke about domestic issues and the way he talked about terrorism. Is there a disconnect between the attention that many people in the United States and around the world have on terrorism and the way the president addressed it last night, Congresswoman?
Well, I would say there's a disconnect with the Republicans. You know, I really resent the fact that the Republicans may be critical of the president on foreign policy, terrorism, and they are the ones that are holding up adequate funding for the Department of Homeland Security. Even after Paris, we had a vote, and they had the nerve to attach these poison pills of anti-immigrant amendments onto the Department of Homeland Security. I think the president talked about a wise and measured and thoughtful foreign policy, and he did ask the Congress to come together and to fund this effort against ISIS. He didn't go into great elaboration, but I think the president has conducted a thoughtful foreign policy, and right now the Republicans won't even let us have an adequate Homeland Security bill.
Sometimes I think, Antonio, unless we're going to send 100,000 young men and women in harm's way into the theater, into the battlefield, they're sometimes just not happy. Look, this is the president. I remember when George Bush, you probably remember this. Antonio, remember when George Bush, the president, said, not that important to get Osama bin Laden? Well, Barack Obama got Osama bin Laden. Remember when the president said it was over? As a matter of fact, every time I think about Saddam Hussein, here's what occurs to me. He was against Al-Qaeda, and he was also a buffer against Iran. Now what is our problem in Iraq? Because of our military intervention, you got ISIS because of that intervention, and you have Iran stronger than ever.
You get the argument that ISIS.
This president has done a lot.
That ISIL is a result of the civil war in Syria and pulling all our troops out of Iraq. But let's not get into that debate, because I want to ask a final question to both of you. A controversy over Speaker John Boehner inviting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to speak before Congress. The White House said the speaker's not following protocol. What is your reaction?
Well, of course, you know, Israel is our great ally in the Middle East. I think it is awkward, just a short time before the presidential election in Israel, which is going to be happening in March, and while we have before the House some important discussions about how we address the negotiations with Iran to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. So I think there is a certain amount of politics in this invitation, although, you know, we certainly do want to continue to have a bipartisan close relationship with the State of Israel.
I don't know that it is going to serve the best purposes of achieving peace and reconciliation in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I have always been for a two-state solution. I want Israelis and everybody that lives in Israel to be able to live in peace and security, but I also want a free, democratic, prosperous Palestinian state where they can have a nation too. I think that is the road to, how would I say, democracy and to freedom and to justice. And I don't know that just before an election, right, in which this could play an important card, we want to invite somebody. Just before the election, really, I don't know. Look, just because you might not think Netanyahu shouldn't come and speak, and this might not be an appropriate time, doesn't have any indication about your fidelity to the cause of peace between Israel and the Palestinians and reaching a peaceful solution.
Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, Congressman Luis Gutierrez, pleasure to have you both with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio.